Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience, and welcome to the webinar titled How Oracle ARISg Safety Migration Work, presented by Dr. Rodney Lemery, Vice President of Safety and Pharmacovigilance at BioPharm, and Richard Wells, Head of Sales at Valiance. I'm Eugene Stefanoff, the Marketing Manager at BioPharm, and I will be going over some housekeeping items before I turn it over to Rodney and Richard. During the presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. However, you may submit questions to the speaker at any time today by typing them in the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. Please state your questions clearly, and keep in mind other webinar participants will not see your questions or comments. Nonetheless, your questions to the speakers will be addressed as time allows towards the end of the presentation. If you still have unanswered questions after the webinar or would like to request additional information from BioPharm or Valiance, feel free to visit our company's website for contact information. We'll also be giving the contact information at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on BioPharm's website within 24 hours. We will also be emailing you a link to the recording and the PDF version of the presentation. This concludes our housekeeping items. I would now like to turn the call over to Dr. Rodney Lemery and Richard Wells. Rodney, do you want to go ahead and take it from
here? Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today. So today we just want to cover an overview of the data migration effort that our two companies have partnered to perform. We're going to look at, in general, some of the issues that come up with data migration efforts in our industry. We are going to look at what we believe the industry is looking for as a potential solution for these migration opportunities, and then we're going to cover our specific solution to the problems identified in the previous two slides. So Richard, I think you're first, so I'm going to just go to the next slide and let you start the discussion.
Thank you, Rodney. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Richard Wells of Valiance Partners here. I head up our Sales and Business Development Initiative, and over the past several years I have had the opportunity to work closely with a number of our clients with safety data migrations and ARISg migrations, and specifically, and that's given me the opportunity to really speak to them in depth about the challenges that they see in the industry. And I have with me here today Mark, who is one of our senior migration consultants, and Mark is one of our senior people in implementing or designing and executing these safety data and ARISg migrations. And I'm hoping that between the two of us, some of what we've heard and seen with our clients and the solutions we've put in place have enabled us to, will enable us to outline to you the Exel migrate solution that we have put together with BioPharm to present to clients looking for solutions to migrate to ARISg. I'll start off by just taking a look at the state of the industry, as Rodney suggested. Research or studies have been done into understanding what the state of the migration industry is and how companies address these challenges and the types of challenges that they face when they're implementing these migration projects. And this particular table is looking specifically at GXP migrations. And what was found some years ago was that at the point in time, only 16% of migrations were being done we'll say successfully, without impact to budget or schedule. Now, over some years, that number has improved, and it's now in the range of something like 60%. But when you think about it, 4 out of 10 migrations going over budget and or over schedule is a significant portion. So we're obviously seeing significant challenges in the industry. And the chart here shows when people are surveyed the nature of what they view as the challenges that cause them to have issues with their migrations. And if we just focus on the big bars at the bottom where the major of the problems are, if you look at the numbers, I think that's 1, 3, and 7, we're looking at things like scoping issue, data quality, and a lack of clarity on how to address data quality issues. We see that the data and the requirements that people face are a significant challenge in successful migrations. If you look at the other ones that are at the top of the list, you're looking at things like expectations, lack of support from users, the methodology, and so we're pointing to the fact that the methodology and the data are what's causing the problem. Now, this isn't a surprise to us because frankly, when you're having the methodologies that are traditionally used, which I'll get into in a moment, the methodologies that are traditionally used are not designed to address the data quality challenges, and therefore the methodologies are flawed when it comes to finding a way to implement migrations successfully. Now, this is GXP migrations, if you will. We're speaking specifically to ARISg migrations or safety data migrations, and when we look at safety data migrations, we have additional challenges that cause us problems here. First of all, when you're implementing a migration, you're looking at some form of a tool. So what are we going to be using? Some companies will look at ETL tools, and ETL tools are very effective at database migrations, but they do not have built-in facilities to manage the nuances of safety data migrations, if you will. It really becomes starting from scratch, looking at the database. And we're looking at, companies are often looking at E2B, for example, as a way to, there are tools in place that help them transfer E2B records, but most of the migrations that we see, in fact, all of the safety data migrations that we see, have a requirement to migrate non-E2B fields. So you're now looking at an E2B standard and some other form of tool or scripting in order to get the data to move where you need it to move. The methodologies that are used tend to rely on a manual validation approach, and this is very time intensive. And this affects all GSP migrations, but it's particularly valid here with the safety data, in the safety data realm, because you don't really get more critical data than what's going into safety data systems. So the validation requirements are not going to be more stringent than they are here. This is where those most stringent requirements are. So that labor-intensive role is going to be emphasized and have a great impact on both cost and schedule. And when we talk about methodology, we'll see how that can magnify into a significant problem. And as a result, and additionally, there are functional gaps that may be identified during a migration, and this requires us to go back and take a look at how the systems are configured. And we'll speak to that as we go through the presentation today as well. So you've got approaches today based on custom scripting. They use manual sampling, and they become very repetitive and do not address the sort of requirements we see. If we look at the data level, and if you recall back to the first issues I said, what are the challenges we have? Data quality and methodology. So I think most people on the call will be able to comprehend that data quality is an issue because you've got a system, an AERS system, shall we say, on one side going into an ARISg system on the other, and they weren't designed to do that. And although there are some standard configurations, every customer system is configured differently. So we're taking data from one system and trying to move it to another system. And we're going to have to transform that data along the way, and understanding how that data is going to fit in the target system and be viewed and used by users in that system has never been a good way to analyze those gaps effectively, and therefore understand the data quality issue. So you can sort of understand how that plays into the data quality being at the top of the list when we looked at challenges. This is related to methodology because what happens in today's traditional way of implementing migrations is we use a sampling methodology to test the migrations. And we pull a sample of the data in the test system and we find some error and we remediate that error. We go back to and pull another sample from the next migration we do, the test migration, and because it was a sample, the second one has error that wasn't in the first. And you can understand that, well, if I couldn't effectively address my data quality issues before, and I know I'm running this test with those unidentified data quality issues in place, well, how many times am I going to have to repeat this sampling methodology until I get to the point where I'm comfortable? And then take it one step further and say, okay, let's say we get to the point where we are comfortable with our testing and we go to validation, and your sampling approach and validation now also starts to pull out those errors. Now we have validation processes, we've got documentation issues, and it becomes a whole different issue with how we remediate those errors and the hoops we have to jump through, if you will, in order to get to the point where we're comfortable and ready to go forward. So these create significant challenges in the migration environment. So when we are speaking with our clients and we talk to them about not just their requirements, but about the kind of things they'd like to see in solutions today, there are a number of things that come to light. They're looking for a track record of success and experience in migrating safety data. Of course, safety data migrations aren't new. Companies have been doing it for quite some time. I think the reason they're looking for this is because companies have done these migrations and suffered through the pain of the issues I spoke to, and aren't necessarily looking for someone who has, for a company who is doing it the way it's always been done, but are effectively putting another way of saying, can you show us solutions that are more effective than what we've got today? They're looking for someone with that kind of experience. They're looking to be able, they're looking to get out of the manual and scripting approach. Is there some form of out-of-the-box way of doing these migrations? As I said before, the configurations for safety systems, whether it be AERS or ClinTrace or ARISg, are somewhat standard. And although each customer will configure or customize it to a certain degree, it's somewhat standard, and companies are aware of this, and so they're looking at, okay, there are these standard configurations, mine are a little bit different. Have I got a new kind of solution that will enable me to leverage some kind of out-of-the-box configurations in order to overcome the issues that we've had and seen in the past? And then on the back end, when we're testing these migrations, it's interesting if you ask a client, well, okay, with a traditional approach, you might use some form of data sampling. Tell me, what's the acceptable level of error that you're willing to take in this data migration, this safety data migration? And of course, the answer is always, well, none. But sampling itself as a process is driven by an acceptable level of error. To determine your sample size, one of the first things you'll do is determine what your acceptable level of error is going to be. If you put in acceptable level of error as 0, it will tell you need a sample size of 100%. So, traditionally, of course, that wasn't available, so companies have had to do sampling, but really they're looking for a way to get rid of that error level. And then finally, companies instinctively know that this process must be user-driven. Migrating data between two systems, and even knowing that you did it with 100% accuracy, does not ensure that the data will show up and be usable in the target system as the users are anticipating. And companies are aware of this, and they want users involved in that process. The big challenge, though, is because we're sampling, if we get into a scenario where we're repeatedly sampling, your burden on your users becomes impractical, and all of a sudden you now are not only using a sampling system that isn't testing 100%, you're not able to get the users involved to the level that you really need them to be to ensure that the migration can be successful. Rodney, I think there are a couple of things on the next couple of slides that perhaps you want to speak to.
Sure. So, in the past 2 to 3 years that BioPharm's been working with Valiance on these migration efforts, we've also found what many researchers in the field of health information systems have found, and that is that there are some procedural concerns in these migration efforts as well as technological concerns. And Richard's already alluded to a few of those. On this slide, I'm giving you some recent research from some health information key players in the industry who have suggested that many times the clear agenda for these types of migration efforts is really important. The scoping of the project, testing, all things procedure related, and especially, and we will talk about this in the next coming few slides, the functionality of the application post the data migration. So this is beyond just getting the information from the source into the target, but it's actually then making sure that the application fully functions. And then in addition to these types of scope and testing issues that come up with data migration efforts, there are oftentimes training and process reengineering concerns that have to be addressed. These could be new systems being implemented, so the source may be a legacy system and the new target may be, for example, ARISg safety, which means processes that are currently written to, say, Empirica Trace would need to be updated and users would have to be retrained on the new system. So this type of proper training and process reengineering for your team and staff are also key to the success of these migration projects. This is where the partnership between our two companies has been very successful in that we bring to the table a large amount of pharmacovigilance and safety expertise from a wide variety of companies, generics firms, devices, biologics, and pharma. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay. So basically our solution then is a intensive partnership that we've branded Exel Migrate. And in this process, what we perform are detailed assessments, which may include the data mapping, which Richard will talk about in a moment, high-level scoping, data dictionary concerns, data discovery concerns. We do tend to offer these in a fixed fee engagement, but this would require the project to be very well scoped, which, if you remember in the previous slide, was one of the important key success factors for these types of engagements. Richard, do you want to talk specifically about the migration effort?
I'll speak to it on the next slide, Rodney.
Okay. So let's go to the unique methodology then. We'll just jump right in.
Okay. I want to now walk through the process that BioPharm and Valiance have put in place for the Exel Migrate solution. Now, in the traditional process I spoke to, we were relying on manual sampling for our testing approach, and scripting and ETL tools, for example, for the actual migration. So a couple of key things have changed in that process. We obviously have a mapping process and a planning and requirements gathering process that we walk through with BioPharm and our clients in order to make sure that we're putting an initial mapping specification in place. And then what we do next is we walk through a pre-migration testing process. If you recall, one of the challenges I spoke to earlier was the inability to address data quality issues and understand the data quality issues and the data cleansing requirements early in the process. Valiance has automated testing technology that we adopt at this point in time to ask the question, okay, if I look at data in my source and apply a transformation, will it fit into my target? Now, this doesn't necessarily have to apply to the target fields per se. We can apply assumptions to that and help identify errors For example, if we look at the WHO metric coding and the product naming dictionaries that companies require, we can use this process to test the consistency of those and to test that values in the source will in fact are going to map to valid values in the target. And that's one of the biggest issues, is making sure those things are all clean and those things are all consistent as you move through the migration. And errors in that can lead to considerable data remediation efforts later. So we can use this process early with an automated tool in order to identify those cleansing requirements early and really refine the process. And when you talk about the errors I mentioned earlier, the scope, the data quality issues, this really helps overcome a lot of those issues. And as Rodney mentioned previously, this is where one of the tools we use to help us be able to put in place the fixed price migration efforts that Rodney alluded to. From there, we then go into a process where we're setting up the migration and configuring the tools. The thing to point out here is, as I mentioned earlier, the methodology we're adopting here is leveraging the fact that the safety data management solutions out there tend to have standard configurations. So we have configurations out of the box for our migration and our migration testing tools. And what we need to work on the configuration isn't configuring the entire migration, it's configuring the delta between the standard configurations and the client's configurations on each of the source and targets. And also, we're doing this in a configurable software application. That software application can be qualified by the clients. And now, as we go through our process and update those configurations, we're doing it in a qualified software interface, if you will, and we do not have to be going back and redeveloping and revalidating scripts. When you combine that reduced validation effort, configurable software, which is quicker and more efficient to put together than the scripts themselves, and the fact that we're using out-of-the-box configurations, we now have a much more cost-efficient way of getting that migration configured. And then we move into our testing. Now, of course, when you're testing a migration, you're testing it first of all in informal testing environments. And when you're using the traditional process of sampling, as I said, you're pulling a sample, you're testing it, you're finding error, you're repeating that process until you're comfortable. Sometimes that may be a few iterations, sometimes it is a lot. Here, at the highest level, we're running the test into the test environment. We're testing 100% of that with TrueCompare. Because we're testing 100%, after that first full run, we now know that all of the error, and we can now remediate all of the error. And so when we do the second dry run into that informal test environment, there is no error. Now, speaking at a very high level, obviously the process is a little bit more back and forth than that as you do iterations of different phases and things like that. But at the highest level, you can understand the concept is test it once, fix all the error, test it a second time to verify that that error is fixed. Now, when we move through into our validation environment, we're also using TrueCompare to test 100%, but we already know we've remediated the error. And so our validation and production migrations now become execution of that process and walking through that process as opposed to uncovering further error that needs to be remediated and go through the sort of cumbersome validation process that might be involved. I do also want to point out, one of the things we mentioned earlier was the importance of user involvement. So when I talk about that 100% testing, I'm talking about the data level error that we can identify both pre and post migration. That does not negate the importance of making sure that during those dry runs, users are involved in that process. We usually have partial dry runs early on, and users are looking at the records, the case data in their target ARISg system. They're reviewing that data and providing that feedback. And because we're testing 100%, we don't have them looking repeatedly during an ongoing process of sampling. Their involvement can be defined at the appropriate points and times, and you can imagine how that helps stick with your schedule and keep your budgets on track as well. And so you can see how this entire process now is linked to data quality. by addressing the data quality and identifying those issues early and then testing 100% of the data, we now have a methodology that supports that and allows the process to be defined as opposed to being iterative and unable to be defined as to sort of how many iterations you might have to go through to finalize it. Here, we've got a predefined testing element. Rodney, I'm not sure if you wanted to speak to that last bullet before we move to the next slide.
Sure. I'll just make a brief statement here that as we've kind of already talked about, the process reengineering piece is very critical to the success of these types of projects. And I think the bullet point here, what we're really trying to focus you on here, is that sometimes the process reengineering pieces can affect the data migration mapping, and we certainly as a team have seen this over the past few years, where once the users learn something new, for example in the ARISg safety application, they may request a configuration to be added to code list values or workflow states in the system that need to be manipulated or added, which do have an impact on the data migration itself and the mapping. So that type of, again, close partnership and parallel process reengineering pieces can have a really big impact on the overall success of the migration effort. And along that same line, again, BioPharm in partnership with Valiance, we really do bring to the table a large amount of practical experience with a variety of different companies and types of companies, which gives us exposure to a lot of data that perhaps we wouldn't have seen otherwise. Migration of device-centered data, for example, can be very different from the migration effort of biopharmaceutical type data. And that is certainly something that we've had to encounter, experience, correct, and refine over the past few years. Again, we have a methodology that we approach the SOP rewriting and process reengineering pieces of these types of projects so that it is done in a structured manner, organized, and as Richard said, involving the end user community. It's very important. And we have done some very heavy data migrations, and we've also done light data migrations. So there have been a variety of different types of projects over these past 3 years that we've been involved in. And again, that just goes to the experience and breadth of our offering. And I really wanted to focus on here on this slide, the actual data mapping and process focus that we partner with. And I'm sure, Richard, you'll want to speak about the ins and outs of the mapping, but I just wanted to, in this slide, make sure that we underscore the importance of user involvement. And really, we couldn't stress more emphatically the need for the user community to actually functionally test the application post the migration effort. And again, in a moment, we will discuss the actual process. And Richard, I think you'll speak more to this, but I definitely just wanted to underscore that the process reengineering piece is important, but we've found over the past several years that the user involvement in the functional testing after one of the migration runs has been executed becomes hypercritical to the acceptance of the migration effort itself. Richard, maybe you want to elaborate.
Yeah, so before I move on, the last thing I really want to do is introduce the tools, but I will take a moment to speak a little bit to the mapping process, because the methodology I spoke to before, the migration process, deals with how we execute those mappings, configure the software, and go through and test and execute on the migrations. But within that process, one of the most critical points is, as Rodney mentioned, the effectiveness of the mapping process. And it's sometimes an overlooked area, and you have to look at it from both the source and the target systems. And the way Valiance looks at this is we will first look at the target values to be populated, go through those, make sure that we have data coming from where that data is coming from in the source system, and ensure that those mappings are put in place. But then we'll also go and make sure that we're looking through the source system to ensure that all of the data that needs to be captured is actually being mapped somewhere. And we have a process whereby we walk through that with the clients to make sure that is in place. And this really, obviously, I think, cannot be done without appropriate user involvement. When we do this initially, this is what will help drive the pre-migration testing. But once that is done, the users are going to have to again be involved in the process in remediating the issues that have been identified during the pre-migration testing. It's not enough to just have them look at it once and assume everything is mapped going to map the way they want it. They really need to make sure they're looking at it after that pre-migration testing as well and understand what it's going to look like. That's the final key point to making sure that the scope and the requirements and the mapping are effective. And if you recall right at the beginning, the biggest issues were around the scope and the requirements. And this is the chance you've got to leverage a defined mapping process along with pre-migration testing to really get that mapping specification right. Not to say there won't be tweaks later on as issues are uncovered, but this is the chance to get it right and really set the stage for successful migration.
Richard, maybe I can just underscore this further with a practical example. So over the past many migrations, we have uncovered some very interesting nuances in the data migration effort that, if we had not involved the end user community, would probably go unnoticed. And the one that really sticks in my mind is the inability to gather the correct U.S. license data into an NDA periodic report for ARISg safety migrations. So there are some very specific database fields that must be populated in order for certain cases to be available to the NDA periodic report, the PATO report inside of ARISg. And if we had not involved the end user community in that type of periodic reporting testing, that migration issue would not have come to light. So again, just kind of underscoring what Richard's saying, the importance of that type of user acceptance testing for these mapping execution runs.
Okay. Thank you, Rodney. I'll proceed on to a brief overview of the tools, and then I see there are some questions coming through, so we'll look forward to an opportunity to answer those. One of the critical aspects of the approach is the ability to use out-of-the-box tools, True Migrate and True Compare. So I'll introduce them each briefly. First of all, True Migrate, as the name implies, is the tool that actually executes the migration. It will connect to the databases on the source and the target systems. It is compatible with a wide variety of systems, and what this means for safety data is simply if you need to be pulling data from something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, for example, or maybe you've got data in an AERS system and a trace system that you need to migrate, and you need to be pulling it from both systems. This enables you to use both of those as source systems and supplemental systems for executing data cleansing requirements. There's a user interface for configurations, which implies that, as I said, the process is more efficient. However, don't let that hide the fact that the mapping capabilities behind the product are very robust. The vast majority of our migrations involve rules that are simply configured in the interface and don't require any behind-the-scenes scripting or coding. And when I say vast majority, I'm talking 95%. So we refer to True Migrate as being application aware because it's not simply like an Excel tool attaching itself to a database. As we'll see in a few slides, it's compatible with non-safety data systems as well. We have the ability to talk to content management systems, complaints management systems, things like that. So we're aware of those behind-the-scenes applications. In this particular case, when we're talking about safety, we have the out-of-the-box configurations that I mentioned too. And I'll also point out that this solution and the TrueMigrate and TrueCompare software has been adopted in over 400 DXP migrations to date. So it has a good and acceptable, stellar, if you will, track record of being used in these stringent environments. And while TrueMigrate does bring those efficiencies and is a critical role in the process, really it's fair to say that TrueCompare is the key to the process, because it is the ability to do that, both that pre and post migration testing, that is what enables the process, the methodology to be as effective as it is. So similar here, you have the ability to connect to a wide array of sources. Over here, we're not moving data, we're simply comparing the data in the source to the data in the target, or comparing it in the source to a certain assumption, if you will, in the case of pre-migration testing. And this is being done across 100% of the records and 100% of the fields. And we do content comparisons as well via MD5 hash keys. Now, I think the benefits here, the 100% testing benefit, I don't know if that needs to be explained any further. It does have, obviously, with compliance being as critical as it is, it allows you to minimize the numbering of test iterations, as I said. You've got the compliance documentation that you need to verify with appropriate regulatory bodies that the migration was undertaken in accordance with the specification. The pre-migration testing identifies 40 to 60% of your data errors, so you can imagine how that helps with the specifications. And one last point is the return on investment, because return on investment is not always associated with migration tools. But as if we get the opportunity to speak further with some of you with regards to your specific migration requirements, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at the efficiencies that this can bring to the table, and how it can, even for modest scale migrations, how it can really make them more cost effective. We do often get asked when we're talking about TrueCompare about the types of errors that TrueCompare will identify. So we can see here you've got just a few examples. Mapping specifications errors. It happens where an error is, for example, a little bit ambiguous. So someone's configured it in the software tool and in the testing tool as best they can, but it turns out to be inaccurate. And the differences between what's configured in the testing tool and the migration tool will bring those errors to fore and allow you to sort of remedy that and adapt the specification as required. Again, errors can happen when you're configuring the migration tool, so those errors will also be identified during the testing process. When we go through the process of data cleansing, users may fill out spreadsheets, for example, to identify how certain issues need to be remediated, but they may fill those out in error or use values that are not valid in the destination system. Again, we're configuring TrueCompare to test the supplemental data sources and those values and transformations as well. So if those kind of errors occur, they'll also be picked up. Certain data level errors, if you're leaving certain fields with a null value, or if certain values are getting, if mandatory fields are being omitted, if certain values are being truncated beyond what is anticipated due to configurations in the target system, all of these types of things will also be adopted. And then there are process errors, and Rodney alluded to one. And we've seen these kind of errors also where users have had issues in the product naming tables and have failed to, in a critical part of the process, which was validated, but they failed to update product naming values in the target system. And what would have happened during sampling is that error would highly unlikely to have been uncovered, but then as further cases were added, those cases would have invalidated their analysis capabilities, their historical analysis on that data. And TrueCompare was able to pick that up, the process that was able to be remediated and effectively migrated, validated, and taken through to production. We also get asked about the pre-migration testing. So just a couple of simple examples to sort of help identify what the pre-migration testing involves. For example, if you've got mandatory fields in your target, pre-migration testing will help identify areas where there is no value that you've got mapped coming from your source into those values. If you've got data that is to be truncated in the target that is too long in the source, you'll be able to identify those types of errors and bring those out into play beforehand. It'll help you with your data duplication. We can configure it to help look at, to define ID rules on the data and identify if we have data duplication issues before we go through the migration process. And then critically with the product naming tables, the measure and the who, it helps us we can configure rules to test whether or not we've got all of the values that we would be migrating in from our source are valid values in accordance with those lists in the target. And those things can all be tested during the pre-migration testing phase. As I said, in summary, this is a proven solution. BioPharm and Valiance have worked successfully at many clients now with the Exel migration solution to bring them into play. I'll pull your attention to the second and third quotes, where if you call back to what we said about the questions of, gee, our acceptable level of error is 0, I think these are a couple of examples from clients that have really have used this process and these tools and really found it has helped them not only have an efficient migration, but a successful migration, realizing that under traditional approaches, issues would have gone through into their production environments. And when it comes to, when we're talking further about requirements, we're happy to work with you and arrange for, to have discussions with customer references as appropriate. I did mention before also that the software and tools can be used across a wide array of systems. I pointed out here because when you're looking at migration solutions, there are also synergies to be had if you are looking for if you have other requirements, and there are synergies to be able to have using the tools and the methodology in other GXP environments, should that be appropriate. That concludes my speaking portion of it. Rodney, Eugene, I'll hand it to you if you want to sum things up and then oversee what looks like will be an interactive Q&A session.
Sure. Thank you so much, Richard and Rodney. So I will go ahead and ask the questions that were presented to us in the webinar. Feel free to ask your questions as well in the chat feature. Just type them in and we'll try to get to them as many as possible. And I'll ask Richard and Rodney to go ahead and answer them as you feel necessary. So the first question is, does the migration concern only safety data or also configurations?
Richard, do you want me to take that?
Yes, Rodney, I think that's appropriate.
Sure. So yes, that is true. We have not performed migrations where we migrated the actual configuration data. This is usually because as we stated in this webinar, the process reengineering piece is kind of ongoing, which means that configurations may need to be updated or changed or at least addressed and reviewed prior or in parallel rather to the data migration effort happening. So to date, all of our migrations have included a manual configuration or reconfiguration depending on the needs of the client. Therefore, the automated configuration migration has thus far been out of scope. But I should mention, and Richard, please correct me if I'm wrong, the tool itself could absolutely be used to migrate the configuration data should that become a requirement in the future.
Well, technically speaking, yeah, that is correct. It could be done, but as you say, it's not typically the recommended process.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question, I think this is good for Rodney. The solution that you are offering does not involve Oracle at all. The reason I ask is because previously we had Oracle come in and assist with both validation and migration.
Yes, that That is true. We are not proposing the use of a partnership with Oracle Corporation, although we are gold partners with Oracle. So we do have access to information and resources, etc., with that partnership. But that is correct. We do these migration efforts completely independent of the Oracle group.
Great. How much time would you plan for the entire migration from start of the project, such as from ARISg to the final migration and being able to use Argus as a running system?
Yeah, that's a, without further information, that's obviously a fairly difficult question to give a specific response to. I would say that when we're dealing with modest case volumes, let's say 500 to 5,000, you could expect anywhere from 3 to 6 months for the migration portion of it. Again, there's a caveat there in that what are potential supplemental sources? What's the nature of the configurations? And all, there are things there that we don't know that could offer opportunity to shorten a little or provide the necessity to lengthen that a little. When you get to larger scale migrations, it's not uncommon for us to be involved in projects that are running for 6 to 12 months. And in fact, at the moment, we have projects that have been going for over a year when you've got sort of the hundreds of thousands of cases and you're looking at multiple phases and iterations of the migration. So I would highly suggest that you have a think about the case volumes and the requirements that you might have, and then contact either Valiance or BioPharm, and we can speak further and very quickly get you a more concrete idea of what the actual timeline might look like in your case.
Great. The next question, since Japan data is very different from raw data, such as PMDA, DTD, for example, there seems to be conflict during the migration. This is a broad question. Basically, I'm asking if there are Japan migration considerations going from another database to Argus J.
Actually, I'll ask Mark Hughes to respond to that. If you recall, I did introduce him earlier as one of our senior safety migration consultants, and he has quite a bit of experience working on the Japanese migration front.
Yes, there actually are definite considerations moving from that data source to Argus. Both BioPharm and Valiance have had extensive experience working with Japanese sources like this. In fact, we have a project going on right now. We have a team over in Japan working on this. So we definitely have experience working with this sort of information. It definitely is definitely an apples to oranges sort of migration, but it's not something that we haven't handled before.
Great. Thank you. The next question is, we are currently using Empirica 4.3 and have multiple instances, and when we migrated previously, we had to migrate the instances individually with running through a lot of different steps. Are you saying that this solution is completely automated?
Yeah, depending on the multiple instances, a lot of times if we have multiple sources that are completely different from each other, then yeah, it does make sense to have multiple ways just because the data leads to that. So in other words, if the data is completely separate and completely different, then they might have different requirements. And if there's different requirements from the different sources, then yes, that would lead to more or less different mini migrations at the same time. But if the sources are similar in nature, we could have a lot of reusability on whatever configurations that we create for the separate sources. So it really depends on the nature of the separate sources. If they're close in nature, then sure, we can have a lot of reusability there. If not, then they would require more fine-tuning of the configurations to do the different migrations. As far as fully automated, our tools are fully automated. The process that we go through is fully automated. However, there is definitely a give and take during the dry run, so there will be some back and forth that during configuration time, there is going to be some give and take that the automation won't be taking place. But basically, at the end of the project, the configuration should be in a place that we can take advantage of those fully automated capabilities to basically reduce runtime and things like that.
Yeah, I'll add to that just a little bit, something I perhaps omitted when I was speaking to the tools, that the software is automated, and obviously one of the big benefits is once you've configured the migration and the testing, when you have to do it again for the second dry runs, it's already configured, and you may be making certain changes, but you just have to push that button again. That's the key driver of efficiencies. But as Mark said, that does not remove the necessity for user involvement. As I said right at the beginning of the presentation, one of the big issues was one of the things that clients wanted was a user-driven process. So you cannot automate the process to the extent that you negate that back and forth. There is going to be, during the dry runs, there is going to be interaction with users as they make sure that not only is the data migrated according to the spec, but they can use it and see it in the target system in the way that they need to be.
Great, thank you. The next question is, I do understand that you're doing a 100% check of the migrated data. Will there be enough documentation evidence to pass an FDA inspection to ensure that all data from the old system, such as ARISg, was migrated into ARGUS?
I'll start that off, and Mark, supplement it if you would like. There are a couple of things to be had here. So first of all, on the 100% testing, the TrueCompare tool will provide the output necessary, if you will, to verify that the source to target transformations were implemented in accordance with the specification. However, that in and of itself does not qualify, I would say, as a level of documentation that is sufficient. So the migration process includes the development of a migration qualification protocol and a summary report. Now the migration qualification protocol is out-of-the-box documentation that comes with Valiance software, and that process walks you through, that defines and walks you through the actual validation process. And that will include scripts for testing the software to ensure that it's qualified and working as it should, that it's configured as it should be, and then the steps for executing the software and testing the actual migration. Those things in combination provide you with the documentation required, and Valiance BioPharm executed migrations have been audited, the result audited by the FDA, and to date there have been no deficiencies found on that front. Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, you have it.
Great, thank you. The next question is, for the actual migration, after the testing and validation is done, how long would the users be offline during switching from one database to the other? As during testing and validation, the old system will be in use and the new data will be added.
Yeah, this is always one of the biggest challenges, the least of which is because the users need to have access to their data, or the most of which. So the reality is, the short answer is that it depends on a lot of different factors. There are certain immutable laws that we have to sort of work around. It takes time to put records into Oracle. So we have a bunch of different strategies that can help that. We can have multi-processing. We can throw more resources at the jobs when they're running. The reality is it depends on how much data we're going to be moving. It depends on the resources that we have to extract and insert the data. Typically, though, I'll tell you that we try to obviously minimize it, and typically we try to get it down to a weekend. That's usually the most acceptable thing for most clients. A lot in some cases for modest engagements, we could do it over one day, one night. It really depends on a lot of different factors, but I will tell you that is probably when we start looking at a job, when we start looking at what we have to do, it's probably the most important thing that we try to figure out, because the downside, there's a lot of issues that you need to factor in for downtime. If we need to get resources to deal with it, if we need to rethink our strategy, if we need to come up with an interesting way to sort of pre-process the data so that things get done in a timely manner. So this is important considerations that we think about very early on in the process.
Great, thank you. I'm going to jump around a little bit just because we're running short on time. So if we haven't answered your question, we can try to get back to you after the webinar. Next question is, does the migration process also include customizing Oracle ARISg target system to match the legacy trace system customizations?
Richard, I can take that.
Sure, thank you, Rodney.
So yes, I think in general, I'm going to answer this in a general way. So regardless of what your source system is, the configurations or customizations that you have implemented in that source system need to be accommodated in some way in the target system. So we, a while back, did a rather large migration effort of a European pharmacovigilance solution called PVWorks to ARISg, and those had very different configurations than what were traditionally available in the ARISg application. And of course, we had to work with the end user community to make sure that all of those configurations found their way into the target ARISg app. So regardless of what your source or target are, I think that principle that the question is being asked from is an important one to make sure that we accomplish in the migration efforts.
Great, thank you. I think we'll ask one more question and then we'll close up. Can you describe the ETL behind Exel Migrate?
Yes, I think if we look at, see if I can find the right slide here. We did talk to the ETL tool. We don't often refer to it as an ETL tool, but migrate is the software that is used to actually connect to the source and target systems. I did step through this process and the benefits of using it, the configuration, etc. I'm not sure if there's a specific question you're looking to answer, but through migrate, we have pre-configurations for the tool that are configured for the standard configurations of the standard safety systems out there today. The tool will connect to the databases for the source and target system. It will read in the data schema and provides an interface for users to configure, and those users, it's for Valiance, for users to configure. Well, when I say users, I'll be clear, I'm not talking about business users. I should say the migration users, the IT people involved in configuring the migration, to configure the mapping rules and the transformations. There's an interface for doing that. There is an ability to use scripts within the tool if you wish to do so, but as I said, the vast majority of clients don't need to do that. They can configure those rules. You can connect to supplemental systems and configure the rules for merging data from two source systems to represent one unified record in the target. migrate will then, when those configurations are in place, you would use an export utility to export the data from the target, and then import and apply the transformation rules into the target system. Again, if you have more specific questions, feel free to type them in. I don't know that we'll have time to get to them today, but we'll be making a note of them and do what we can to get back to people further. And again, if you have specific requirements, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to discuss them with you and talk to the tools in more detail.
Great. Thank you, Richard. And in the slide in front of you are several ways that you can engage with BioPharm and Valiance. So go ahead and read through those. And in the meantime, I just want to thank everybody for joining this webinar. We will be sending out a link to the recording as well as a PDF version of this presentation within 24 hours. You can always visit biopharm.com and access the webinar there at any time. We have several different webinars coming up, including ones on Empirica Signal and also two others on ARISg migrations, one specifically from AERS to ARISg and another one from Empirica, Trace to ARISg. So feel free to register for those. You can find the links on our website. And last but not least, in front of you is a slide that contains our contact information. You can reach out to us anytime, and somebody will get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you so much for joining this presentation. We hope that you found it helpful, and we look forward to other webinars in the future. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.